December 23rd, 1948, 12:01 a.m. The noose tightens around his neck. Kenji Doihara, the man they called Lawrence of Manchuria, the master spy who orchestrated the opium trade that enslaved millions, who engineered coups and assassinations across Asia, who turned espionage into an industrial weapon, stands on the gallows in Sugamo Prison. His hands are bound, a black hood covers his face, but underneath that fabric, witnesses will later say, his expression is one of complete disbelief. He genuinely thought he'd escape this. Here's what makes Doihara's execution different from every other war criminal hanging. This man spent 30 years manipulating systems, corrupting officials, buying his way out of consequences. He was Japan's most sophisticated intelligence operative, a man who turned bribery and blackmail into an art form. Right up until the moment that trap door opens, some part of him believes he'll find an angle, a leverage point, a way out. Trust me, what you're about to hear isn't just about one man's death. It's about how an intelligence officer who poisoned an entire continent with narcotics, who destroyed governments for imperial expansion, who treated human suffering as currency, finally ran out of people to bribe and faced consequences he couldn't manipulate his way out of. Let me take you into that execution chamber. 7 Class A war criminals will hang tonight. Doihara is among them, defendant number 2, standing next to Hideki Tojo. The room is sparse, cold, institutional. 47 witnesses packed into a converted warehouse, Buddhist priests chanting, American military personnel operating the gallows with mechanical precision. The sound before the execution, heavy breathing, shuffling feet, the creak of rope being tested, and something else, whispered prayers from some of the condemned, but not from Doihara. He's silent, calculating, even now. When they slip the noose around his neck, a guard later reports, Doihara leans toward him slightly and whispers something in broken English. The guard doesn't understand it fully, but it sounds like an offer, like he's still trying to negotiate. You don't negotiate with a noose. Okayama Prefecture, Japan, 1883. He's born into a military family, like so many Japanese officers of his generation. His father is a low-ranking army officer with ambitions for his son. From childhood, Kenji Doihara learns that the path to power in Japan runs through the military. But unlike other officers in training, young Doihara discovers something crucial about himself. He's better at manipulation than combat, better at finding weaknesses than fighting strengths, better at corrupting systems than operating within them. Here's the red flag everyone misses. As a teenager at military academy, Doihara is caught multiple times cheating on examinations. Not because he's stupid, his intelligence scores are above average. He cheats because he enjoys the deception. The thrill isn't in mastering the material, it's in beating the system. His instructors punish him, but they also note something in his file. Demonstrates exceptional capacity for strategic deception and manipulation of authority structures. In most contexts, that's a criticism. In military intelligence, it's a job qualification. He graduates from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1904, just as the Russo-Japanese War is ending. Japan has defeated Russia, and the military is flush with confidence. Young officers like Doihara are being groomed for Japan's next phase, empire building. But Doihara doesn't want to command troops, he wants to command information. In 1913, he's assigned to military intelligence and sent to China for language training. This is where Doihara finds his calling. China in 1913 is chaos. The Qing dynasty has collapsed, warlords are fighting for control, foreign powers are carving out spheres of influence. It's a perfect environment for a man who understands that information is more valuable than ammunition. Doihara spends 8 years in China, learning not just the language but the culture, the politics, the pressure points. He studies which officials can be bribed, which warlords are ambitious, which systems are vulnerable to manipulation. And he discovers something that will define his entire career: opium. Manchuria, 1931–1937. Doihara isn't just running drug operations, he's engineering the political justification for Japanese expansion. And he's doing it through what intelligence agencies call false flag operations, staged incidents designed to create pretexts for military action. The most infamous is the Mukden incident of September 18, 1931. Here's what happens. Japanese military officers, coordinated by Doihara's intelligence network, plant explosives on a section of the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden. The explosion is minor, barely damages the tracks. A train passes over the damaged section minutes later without incident. But that's irrelevant. The explosion gives Japan exactly what Doihara's planners wanted: a pretext. Japanese officials immediately blame Chinese dissidents for the attack on Japanese property. Within hours, the Kwantung Army launches a full-scale invasion of Manchuria, claiming they're protecting Japanese interests. Doihara's role is documented in intercepted communications. He coordinates the cover story, bribes local officials to provide false testimony about Chinese involvement, and manages the propaganda campaign that sells the invasion to the Japanese public. It's a masterclass in manufactured crisis, and it works perfectly. Within months, Japan controls all of Manchuria. They establish Manchukuo, a puppet state nominally ruled by Puyi, the last Qing emperor, but actually controlled by Japanese military authorities. And Doihara? He's promoted to Major General and given even more authority over special operations. The Shanghai Incident, engineering war. But Doihara isn't satisfied with Manchuria. He wants to expand Japanese control further into China. The problem: the international community is already suspicious of Japan's aggression in Manchuria. Another obvious invasion will trigger sanctions, possibly even military intervention by Western powers. So Doihara engineers something more subtle: the Shanghai Incident of January 1932. The plan is diabolically clever. Use Japanese intelligence assets to orchestrate anti-Japanese riots in Shanghai, ensure that Japanese civilians are attacked or appear to be attacked, then use the unprovoked violence as justification for military action. Doihara's agents recruit Chinese thugs, paying them with opium and cash to attack Japanese-owned businesses and assault Japanese residents. The violence is real. Japanese civilians really are hurt, but it's orchestrated, funded, and directed by the very government that will use it as justification for retaliation. When the riots occur, Japanese military forces respond to protect their citizens, but the response is disproportionate: naval bombardment, aerial attacks, a full ground invasion. The incident becomes a full-scale battle that kills thousands of Chinese civilians. Doihara watches from a distance, coordinating intelligence operations, managing agents, ensuring the narrative stays favorable to Japanese interests. In his reports to Tokyo, he describes the Shanghai operation as a successful provocation, not a tragedy, not a regrettable escalation, a successful provocation. He's engineered a war, and he's proud of it. The Rape of Nanking, the intelligence officer who looked away. In December 1937, Japanese forces capture Nanking, the Chinese capital. What follows is one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, the rape of Nanking. Over 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers massacre an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Women are systematically raped. Some estimates suggest 20,000 to 80,000 sexual assaults. Children are killed in front of parents. Civilians are used for bayonet practice, beheaded in killing contests, burned alive. Doihara isn't in Nanking during the massacre. He's in Manchuria, managing intelligence operations. But his role in the atrocity is indirect and arguably more insidious. He controls the information. When reports of the massacre begin reaching international media, Doihara's intelligence network goes into action. They bribe foreign correspondents, intimidate witnesses, confiscate photographs and film, and coordinate a disinformation campaign denying the scope of the atrocities. Western journalists who try to report on Nanking find their sources disappearing, their evidence mysteriously lost, their credentials revoked. Chinese survivors who speak to foreign observers are visited by Doihara's agents, sometimes bribed into silence, sometimes threatened, sometimes simply disappeared. Doihara doesn't personally kill anyone in Nanking, but he helps bury the truth, and in doing so, he enables the atrocity to continue longer than it might have if international pressure had mounted immediately. His justification, documented in intercepted communications, exaggerated reports of military action in Nanking threatened to undermine support for the China campaign. Information management is essential to mission success. He reduces mass murder to a PR problem. The Opium Empire at its peak. By 1940, Doihara's narcotics operation in occupied China is generating an estimated $300 million annually, equivalent to roughly $6 billion today. This isn't a side operation, it's a core funding mechanism for Japan's war effort. The system is vertically integrated. Japanese authorities control the opium fields in occupied territories, operate the processing facilities that turn raw opium into heroin and morphine, manage the distribution networks through puppet governments, and bank the profits through front companies. Doihara oversees it all. He's not a hands-on drug dealer, he's the architect of the system. He sets quotas, evaluates efficiency, troubleshoots distribution problems, and ensures profits flow smoothly to Tokyo. The human cost is incalculable. Families destroyed by addiction, children born dependent on opiates, entire communities economically devastated as productive labor is replaced by drug-seeking behavior. Doihara sees none of this. Or rather, he sees it and categorizes it as effective population control. In one particularly chilling document discovered after the war, Doihara writes to a subordinate, "The effectiveness of opium in reducing resistance activities continues to exceed projections. Recommend expansion of distribution networks in newly occupied territories." He's recommending more addiction, more destroyed lives. Because it's effective. This is the innovation of Doihara's cruelty. He doesn't torture people directly. He creates systems that destroy them indirectly. He doesn't personally execute dissidents. He creates conditions where they destroy themselves. It's evil with plausible deniability, horror with bureaucratic distance. And he documents it all, never imagining that one day those meticulous records will be used to convict him. August 1945. The Collapse. When atomic bombs destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when the emperor announces unconditional surrender, Kenji Doihara is in Manchuria overseeing the withdrawal of Japanese forces ahead of the Soviet invasion. Unlike Hideki Tojo, who attempts suicide when American forces come to arrest him, Doihara doesn't resist. He's a spy, not a warrior. He understands when a situation is unwinnable. But he also understands something else. He has information, valuable information, intelligence networks across Asia, knowledge of covert operations, details about other war criminals. And in his experience, information is currency. People with valuable information can negotiate. When American forces take him into custody on September 3, 1945, Doihara immediately requests to speak with senior intelligence officers. He wants to make a deal. According to declassified documents, Doihara offers to provide extensive intelligence on Soviet operations in Manchuria, Chinese communist networks, and remaining Japanese resistance cells in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The Americans consider it. Doihara's information could be valuable. The Cold War is already beginning. Intelligence on communist activities in Asia is a priority. But then investigators begin uncovering the scope of Doihara's operations, the opium networks, the false flag operations, the systematic destruction of entire communities through narcotics addiction, the role in engineering the Shanghai incident and covering up Nanking. The deal is rejected. Doihara isn't an intelligence asset to be recruited, he's a war criminal to be prosecuted. When he's informed that he'll stand trial instead of being offered immunity, witnesses report that Doihara seems genuinely confused. In his world, everything is negotiable, everyone has a price. The idea that his crimes are too severe to bargain away doesn't compute. The Tokyo Trials. The spy who couldn't manipulate the system. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East begins in May 1946. Doihara is charged with Count 1, waging aggressive war; Count 27, ordering and permitting murder and other inhumane treatment of prisoners of war and civilians; Count 29, recklessly disregarding duty to prevent atrocities; Count 54, conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. But the evidence that truly damns him comes from his own meticulous record-keeping. Intelligence officers are trained to document operations for after-action analysis. Doihara documented everything: the opium operations, the false flag attacks, the bribery networks, the disinformation campaigns. Prosecutors present hundreds of documents signed by Doihara or written by him. There's no plausible deniability. He can't claim he didn't know. His signature is on orders establishing opium distribution quotas. His handwriting is on reports celebrating the effectiveness of narcotics in pacifying populations. The most damning evidence is a series of letters between Doihara and Japanese officials in Tokyo discussing the opium program. In one, dated March 1938, Doihara writes, "The strategic value of opium distribution continues to validate our approach. Populations in treated areas show 60% reduction in organized resistance activity. Recommend continued expansion. Estimated 15 million Chinese now dependent on Japanese-supplied opiates. This dependency creates leverage in all subsequent negotiations and operations." 15 million people. He's celebrating their addiction as a strategic success. When confronted with this document in court, Doihara's response is revealing. "This was a military intelligence operation approved by proper authority. I executed my duties as assigned." No remorse, no acknowledgement of the human cost, just bureaucratic deflection. The testimony. Voices from the Opium Wars. The prosecution calls witnesses who survived Doihara's operations. Their testimony is devastating. A Chinese doctor takes the stand. He describes working in a clinic in Manchuria during the Japanese occupation. He describes patients, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, who became addicted to opium from dens that appeared in their neighborhoods during Japanese occupation. "The opium was cheap, sometimes free. My patients told me Japanese soldiers encouraged them to try it, said it would help with pain, with stress. Within months, entire families were addicted. They sold everything, their farms, their tools, their children's clothes, to buy more. When they had nothing left, Japanese officials offered them work as informants in exchange for opium. The doctor's voice breaks. I watched my community destroyed, not by bombs, by addiction, by design. Doihara sits expressionless during this testimony. His face shows nothing. When the doctor points at him and says, "You did this," Doihara doesn't react. Another witness, a former Chinese official who was targeted by Doihara's intelligence network, describes the intimidation tactics. "They found out my son was using opium. They threatened to cut off his supply unless I provided information on resistance activities. When I refused, they made sure my son could get all the opium he wanted, for free, until he overdosed. Then they came back and asked if I'd changed my mind." His son was 19 years old when he died. The witness stares at Doihara. "You killed him as surely as if you'd shot him, but you used poison that took months instead of bullets that take seconds." Doihara's response when cross-examined: "Intelligence operations require difficult decisions. Individual casualties are regrettable but necessary strategic." A 19-year-old boy deliberately addicted to death, and Doihara calls him a regrettable but necessary casualty. The courtroom is silent. Even the judges, who've heard months of atrocity testimony, seem stunned by the cold calculation. The defense: the spy who couldn't manipulate the system. When Doihara testifies in his defense, he takes a different approach than Tojo. Where Tojo claimed he was simply following orders, Doihara argues that his operations were legitimate intelligence activities standard in modern warfare. "Every nation," he testifies, "engages in intelligence operations that involve morally ambiguous activities. The British used opium in China. The Americans used alcohol prohibition to control populations. I simply employed available tools to achieve strategic objectives." It's an argument based on moral equivalence. Everyone does bad things in war, so why single me out? The prosecution destroys this argument by presenting evidence of scale. Yes, other nations have used narcotics in warfare, but no other nation created an industrial system designed to addict millions for conquest purposes. The prosecutor asks directly, "General Doihara, did you consider the human cost of addicting millions of Chinese people to opium?" Doihara's answer: "I considered the strategic value. The human cost was acceptable within the context of achieving military objectives. 15 million addicts was acceptable. From a strategic perspective, yes." The gallery erupts. Guards restore order, but the damage is done. Doihara has just admitted in open court that he considered the mass addiction of millions of people an acceptable cost of doing business. The verdict: November 12, 1948. After 2.5 years of testimony, after reviewing millions of pages of documents, after hearing from hundreds of witnesses, the tribunal reaches its verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentence: death by hanging. When the verdict is read, Doihara shows the first emotion anyone has seen from him during the entire trial: disbelief. His eyes widen. His mouth opens slightly. For a man who spent his entire career manipulating outcomes, the realization that he can't manipulate this one hits like a physical blow. He stands when asked if he has any final statement. His voice is steady, but there's an edge to it, desperation poorly concealed. "I request the tribunal reconsider. I have valuable intelligence that could serve Allied interests in the coming confrontation with communism, my knowledge of Chinese and Soviet operations." The judge cuts him off. The defendant will sit down. The sentence stands. Even now, even after being convicted of crimes against humanity, Doihara is still trying to negotiate, trying to find an angle, trying to bribe his way out with information. It doesn't work. In his cell after the verdict, Other prisoners report that Doihara spends hours pacing, talking to himself in multiple languages. He's still strategizing, still looking for leverage points, still convinced there must be a way to manipulate the situation. There isn't. December 22, 1948, the final day. Doihara spends his last day in Sugamo Prison cell number 12. Unlike Tojo, who writes formal letters about duty and honor, Doihara writes letters that read like negotiation attempts. He writes to American officials offering intelligence. He writes to his family asking them to petition for clemency. He writes to former colleagues hoping they'll intervene. Every letter is an attempt to find an angle, to create leverage, to manipulate the outcome. None of them work. At 10 p.m., guards inform the 7 condemned war criminals that execution will occur at midnight. Buddhist priests arrive to provide spiritual counsel. Doihara refuses to speak with the priest. Other prisoners report hearing him in his cell, still talking to himself, still planning, still strategizing. Even hours before execution, his brain can't stop trying to find the leverage point that will save him. At 11:30 p.m., guards enter his cell. Time to go. Doihara stands, straightens his prison uniform, and then, according to guard reports, he does something revealing. He asks to speak with the commanding officer. He has information, important information, intelligence that could be valuable. The guard says no, it's too late. Doihara's response, recorded in official reports, "Everything is negotiable. I just need 5 minutes with someone who has authority to make decisions." He still doesn't understand. After 3 years in prison, after a trial that exposed his crimes in excruciating detail, after being sentenced to death, he still thinks this is a negotiation he can win. They walk him to the execution chamber. 6 other condemned men are already there: Tojo, Itagaki, Kimura, Matsui, Muto, and Hirota, all standing at attention near the gallows. Doihara enters the room and his eyes immediately start scanning, looking for exits, evaluating the guards, calculating possibilities. Even now, even here, his intelligence officer's mind is still working. The execution chamber is cold, concrete floor, high ceiling, 7 nooses hanging from a reinforced steel beam, 47 official witnesses standing in careful rows. Buddhist priests chant sutras. The sound echoes off the concrete. Each condemned man is allowed final words. Tojo shouts, "Long live the emperor." Others offer prayers or declarations of innocence. When it's Doihara's turn, witnesses expect something different, maybe a confession, maybe a defiant declaration, maybe another attempt to negotiate. Instead, he says this: "I request a stay of execution pending review of new intelligence I can provide regarding Soviet operations in Manchuria." Even standing on the gallows with a noose inches away, he's still trying to make a deal. The executioner doesn't respond. He simply places the black hood over his head. In the darkness under that hood, Doihara is still talking. Guards can hear him murmuring, not prayers, but what sounds like negotiation terms, offers, attempts to bargain. The noose is positioned around his neck, standard execution protocol, not behind the left ear for optimal neck break. The priest finishes the final sutra, and then Doihara does something that will be reported by multiple witnesses. He whispers one more sentence. It's muffled by the hood, but those closest swear he says this: "I can still be useful." His last words aren't a prayer, not a declaration, not even a curse. They're a sales pitch. The executioner positions his hand on the lever. Doihara's body tenses. Even through his bound hands and the hood, witnesses can see him calculating, still looking for an escape that doesn't exist. The lever is pulled. 12:01 a.m., December 23, 1948. 7 trap doors drop simultaneously. 7 bodies fall through the darkness. The sound is catastrophic in the enclosed space. Wood slamming, ropes snapping tight, the collective impact of 7 men reaching the end of their drops at the same instant. But like Tojo, something goes wrong with Doihara's execution. The standard calculation for military hanging is precise. Based on the condemned person's weight, the drop distance is calibrated to cause instant spinal cord severance at the C2 vertebra. For a man of Doihara's approximate weight, 155 pounds, the drop should be 7 feet 6 inches. Either the calculation is wrong, or the equipment malfunctions, or, as some witnesses will later quietly suggest, the execution is deliberately botched for 7 men who showed no remorse for destroying millions of lives. Doihara's drop doesn't kill him instantly. Medical examiners who later review the execution reports and photographic evidence note that Doihara's neck shows signs of incomplete cervical fracture with primary cause of death being asphyxiation due to tracheal compression. In plain language, his neck didn't break cleanly. The rope crushed his windpipe and he strangled. The witnesses describe what they see. While some of the condemned men hang relatively still, Doihara's body convulses violently. His legs kick, not random spasms, but purposeful movement. The desperate thrashing of a man who's still conscious, still aware, still experiencing every second. One American military observer, a physician required to certify death, writes in his private notes, "Subject D exhibited prolonged physical response consistent with retained consciousness, observable respiratory effort, muscle contractions suggesting voluntary movement for approximately 80 to 110 seconds post-drop." 80 to 110 seconds, more than a minute and a half. For a man who spent his career killing people with slow-acting poison, opium addiction that destroyed lives over months and years, there's a terrible symmetry in dying slowly himself. Count it out, 80 seconds. That's how long Kenji Doihara has to feel what he never allowed his victims to feel. The helplessness of knowing you're dying and being unable to negotiate your way out. No amount of intelligence could save him, no bribe could stop it, no manipulation could change the outcome. For the first time in his adult life, Doihara had no leverage, no angle, no way to make a deal, just a rope and gravity and consequence. The final minutes. Protocol requires the bodies to hang for 20 minutes to ensure complete brain death. During this period, witnesses are required to remain in the chamber. The silence is broken only by the creak of ropes, the shuffle of feet, the scratch of pens as official observers document the execution. At 12:21 a.m., physicians examine each body. They check for pulse, respiration, pupil response. All 7 are officially pronounced dead. Doihara's body is removed from the noose. Official photographs are taken, proof for the historical record. The images show severe bruising around his neck, rope burns, and facial discoloration consistent with prolonged asphyxiation. His neck is at an angle that forensic experts say indicates partial vertebral damage, enough to cause excruciating pain, but not enough to cause the instant unconsciousness of a clean break. He felt it, all of it. The cremation, erasing the spy. Under tribunal orders, the bodies of all 7 executed war criminals are to be cremated immediately and the ashes scattered to prevent nationalist shrines. American personnel transport the bodies to a crematorium. Each is photographed again for official records. Then they're burned. The ashes are intentionally mixed together so no one can separate Doihara's remains from Tojo's or the others. Then they're loaded into military trucks. In the pre-dawn hours of December 23, 1948, the ashes are driven to an undisclosed location and scattered. The official record says only, "remains disposed of per tribunal directive." Some reports suggest the ashes were dumped in Tokyo Bay, others claim they were scattered in a river, still others suggest they were mixed with trash and buried in a landfill. No one knows for certain. The exact location was classified and remained so. Kenji Doihara, the master spy who built networks across Asia, who controlled millions through information and manipulation, who kept meticulous records of everything, ends as anonymous ash scattered in an unmarked location. No grave, no memorial, no intelligence file that future historians can study to understand his final resting place. Complete erasure. For a man whose entire career was built on controlling information, the ultimate irony, he becomes a piece of classified data that no one can access, a mystery with no solution, a file permanently closed. The hidden records. But Doihara's legacy doesn't disappear entirely. His meticulous record-keeping, the same documentation that convicted him, survives. After the executions, American intelligence agencies seize thousands of documents from Doihara's operations, the opium network records, the lists of bribed officials, the details of false flag operations, the intelligence on Soviet and Chinese communist networks. Much of this information is immediately classified. During the early Cold War, American and British intelligence agencies actually used some of Doihara's networks, the same criminal infrastructure that destroyed millions of lives, for their own operations in Asia. Former agents of Doihara's opium network are recruited by the CIA and British MI6. The trade routes he established are repurposed. The bribery networks are maintained. The man is executed, but his system lives on, repurposed by the victors. The moral reckoning. Let's address the question that makes everyone uncomfortable. Was executing Kenji Doihara justice? Or does the fact that Western powers then used his networks for their own purposes undermine the moral authority of his execution? The legal answer is clear. Doihara was convicted by an international tribunal following due process. The evidence was overwhelming. He had no defense except "everyone does it," which isn't a defense. The sentence was proportional to the crime. By every legal standard, justice was served. But morally? That's more complicated. Doihara orchestrated the addiction of an estimated 15 to 20 million people. He engineered false flag attacks that triggered wars. He ran disinformation campaigns that buried evidence of mass atrocities. He treated human suffering as a tool, addiction as a weapon, and death as a metric. And then the countries that executed him for these crimes turned around and used the same networks, the same methods, the same moral calculus in their own operations during the Cold War. Does that make Doihara's execution hypocritical? Or does it just prove that the banality of evil transcends nationality? That any system, given the right circumstances and justifications, will use the same horrific tools Doihara pioneered? The man who believed everything was negotiable. What makes Doihara's story particularly chilling isn't just what he did, it's how he thought. Unlike Tojo, who was driven by rigid obedience to authority, Doihara was driven by complete moral flexibility. In his worldview, there was no such thing as right or wrong, only effective or not effective, useful or not useful, strategically valuable or strategically irrelevant. Addicting millions of people to opium? Strategically valuable. Engineering false flag attacks? Operationally effective. Covering up mass murder? necessary information management. He had completely severed morality from decision-making, not because he was evil in the way we typically imagine evil, cackling villains who enjoy suffering, but because he genuinely believed moral considerations were irrelevant to strategic planning. This is what makes him a cautionary figure for the intelligence community. Doihara is what happens when you train people to treat ethics as obstacles to overcome rather than principles to uphold. When you reward getting results without asking how those results were achieved. When you create systems where effectiveness is the only metric that matters. The Opium Wars never ended. Here's the uncomfortable legacy of Kenji Doihara. The opium warfare he perfected didn't die with him. The opium trade he systematized in Manchuria evolved into the Golden Triangle drug trade that funded conflicts in Southeast Asia for decades. The addiction as weapon strategy he pioneered was studied and replicated, sometimes by the very countries that executed him. During the Vietnam War, both American and Soviet intelligence agencies used narcotics networks for funding and influence operations. The connections between intelligence operations and drug trafficking that Doihara documented in the 1930s became standard practice in the Cold War. Today, we see the same patterns in Afghanistan, where opium production funded various factions for decades. In Mexico, where drug cartels operate with intelligence-level sophistication. In the ongoing opioid crisis in the United States, where pharmaceutical companies used addiction as a business model. Doihara didn't invent using addiction as a weapon, but he industrialized it, systematized it, documented it so thoroughly that future intelligence agencies could use his work as a blueprint. The man was executed, the method survived. The spy who couldn't stop spying. In the end, what damned Kenji Doihara wasn't just his crimes, it was his inability to stop being an intelligence officer even when it was killing him. Right up to the moment the trapdoor opened, he was still trying to negotiate, still trying to find leverage, still convinced that information could be traded for survival. He spent his final words offering intelligence instead of making peace with his conscience. He died trying to make a deal with the executioner. This is perhaps the saddest element of his story. He was so consumed by the spy's mindset that everything is negotiable, everyone has a price, all information has value, that he couldn't conceive of a situation where none of that mattered. The noose didn't care about his intelligence value. The rope didn't negotiate. Gravity doesn't make deals. For 80 seconds, as he strangled at the end of that rope, Kenji Doihara finally encountered something he couldn't manipulate: consequence. The arc of justice, imperfect but inevitable. On December 23, 1948, at 12:01 a.m., justice came for Kenji Doihara. It came slowly, 80 seconds of strangulation instead of instant death. It came imperfectly. Western powers then used his networks for their own purposes. It came late. Millions had already died from his operations. But it came. The man who poisoned a continent with opium died unable to breathe. The man who spent his career manipulating outcomes died unable to negotiate his fate. The man who kept meticulous records of everything was erased from history, his ashes scattered in an unmarked location. No intelligence network could save him. No bribe could buy his freedom. No manipulation could change the outcome. In his final seconds, gasping for air that wouldn't come, Kenji Doihara learned the lesson he spent his entire life avoiding. Some things aren't negotiable. Justice is one of them. The 15 to 20 million people he helped addict to opium never got justice in life. Most died in poverty, their families destroyed, their communities devastated. Doihara's execution didn't bring them back, didn't heal their suffering, but it established something important. Even the most sophisticated intelligence operators, even those who hide behind classification and plausible deniability, even those who claim everyone does it, they can be held accountable. It just takes time, evidence, and the political will to actually do it. Doihara spent 30 years building networks of corruption, addiction, and manipulation. He thought those networks made him untouchable. He was wrong. The gallows don't care about your connections. The noose doesn't negotiate. And 80 seconds of strangulation is a long time to realize you've finally run out of leverage.